Beneath the uniform and badge that were meant to represent justice, two racist cops revealed their true nature: arrogant, prejudiced, and power-hungry. That night, they didn't need a valid reason or evidence. All they needed was to see a black woman step out of a luxury car, and they decided to act like predators masquerading as protectors. They believed that cheap power gave them the right to humiliate anyone who wasn't like them. They handcuffed her in the middle of the street, in full view of horrified passers-by, thinking it would be another trophy buried in silence. But this time, they had chosen the wrong target. The woman was not just an ordinary citizen. She was Brigadier General Danielle Brooks, a warrior who had commanded the battlefield, an indomitable spirit respected by the United States government. With a single phone call, short, cold, like an order for a military march, Danielle not only freed herself, but obliterated the careers, reputations, and futures of those who dared to touch her dignity. This isn't just the story of two corrupt cops' downfall. It's an uncompromising lesson that those with prejudice in their hearts will always be punished by justice, no matter how many layers of power they wear. "Freeze! You're resisting arrest!" Sergeant Chad Wilkinson snarled, his breath thick with cigarette smoke and malice. He twisted the arm of the black woman behind her, pulling hard enough that her shoulder joint cracked with a cold, sharp sound. The police cruiser waited by the curb, its hood cold as steel under the dim streetlight. The woman was forced down onto it, but her stance remained unwavering. Her back straight as a sword, broad, muscular shoulders, and a face set in determination under the flickering light. No fear, no pleading eyes, only cold dignity. Strength born from years of forging herself in the fire of battle, not from hollow uniforms of power. She turned her head, her sharp gaze cutting through the rain-spattered windshield of the police car, and in a deep, resonant voice, cold as steel, she spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." No yelling, no frantic resistance, just simple, but each word a dagger straight into the cheap confidence of those wielding wrongful power. Across the street, murmurs began to rise. People stopped in their tracks, eyes widened in shock. Phones were quietly raised, cameras started recording every moment. Their faces reflected a chaos mixed with disbelief. A woman handcuffed brutally, yet her demeanor made the entire neighborhood feel suffocated under an invisible pressure. Chad Wilkinson tightened the handcuffs even more, as if trying to reclaim the fragile authority slipping from his grasp. But deep inside, an unsettling chill began to seep, like a trickle of water breaching a wall of arrogance. He didn't know that. His mistake tonight wasn't just an act of unwarranted violence. It was a blow to his career, his honor, and the future he once thought was untouchable. A quiet night, a small sound, and a chain of irreversible events had just been set in motion. But Sergeant Chad Wilkinson could never have imagined that the woman he had just forced down onto the hood of a car, the one he thought was just another black suspect who needed a lesson, was actually someone who could ruin his career with just one phone call. Her name was General Danielle Brooks, a brilliant and renowned military figure in the United States who had commanded highly classified operations in the Middle East, where every decision she made determined the lives of thousands of soldiers. Her titles and medals filled her file, but tonight she wore no military uniform and was not escorted by military vehicles. She was simply an African-American woman, dressed in a plain black coat, dark jeans, and civilian boots, on her way to a top-secret meeting at the Pentagon. With just one sharp glance, a hint of professional composure, Chad and Peter Simmons should have recognized, from her cold demeanor, her steady stride, and the sharp eyes that had seen through war deserts, that this woman was unlike any suspect they had ever encountered. But they didn't look. They didn't want to look. What Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons truly saw and reacted to was simply her skin color and the expensive Mercedes-Benz S-Class parked by the curb under the flickering yellow streetlight. Fancy car, black woman. There must be something wrong. Chad muttered to Peter the moment Danielle stepped out of the car, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Just like the description the center reported, Peter half smiled, though in reality there had been no report. It was just the usual excuse, the reflex they pulled out whenever they felt their authority might be challenged. The two officers in their crisp uniforms, badges gleaming in the streetlight, didn't realize that it was they, not the woman before them, who were truly lost. Prejudice, the distorted belief that simply wearing a blue uniform gave them the right to command, threaten, and manipulate anyone who didn't fit the standards they had set in their heads, had led them straight to this moment. The moment when they brutally pushed Danielle Brooks onto the hood of the car, locking her hands in cold metal cuffs, confidently thinking they had control of the situation. What they didn't know was that beneath her simple appearance, the woman they were treating like an outlaw possessed power far beyond any mayor, senator, or local official they had ever nervously bowed to. And when Danielle Brooks looked up, locking eyes with Chad Wilkinson, her gaze, calm, disdainful, and deep as the bottom of the ocean, made the hand holding the cuffs tremble slightly. A small tremor, but enough for his survival instinct to raise a vague alarm. Only, it was too late. The mistake was sealed with the click of the metal cuffs, and the wheels of destruction had begun to turn. Irreversible. The moment General Danielle Brooks gently closed the door of her sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, pulling her coat tighter against the chilly night air, was the exact moment that Sergeant Chad Wilkinson and Officer Peter Simmons, from just a few dozen steps away in the parking lot, locked their gaze onto her like two predators who had caught a whiff of unfamiliar prey. It wasn't the look of diligent law enforcement officers, nor the kind of vigilant stare that duty sometimes requires. It was a look full of smoldering prejudice, a blend of suspicion, disdain, and vague frustration, simply because a black woman was present in a space they silently believed didn't belong to her. Chad squinted, chin tilted in condescension. "This car's got to be trouble," he muttered, his voice low, as if the comment were a reflex, a tone he and his like-minded colleagues had unintentionally honed after hundreds of stop and searches that no one ever bothered to verify. Peter Simmons stood beside him, casually fiddling with his handcuffs on his belt, a quick glance at the radio on his shoulder, and then a mocking smile. "Fits the description of the suspect the HQ just sent," he chimed in, his words light, but like an arrow, they pierced the already tainted air. Of course, there was no description sent that night. No red alerts, no warnings from HQ. It was all a flimsy mask they put over the deep-rooted biases within themselves, like countless times before. In Chad and Peter's warped worldview, a black woman stepping out of an expensive car in this middle-class neighborhood couldn't possibly just be a lawful citizen. No, in their minds, that image immediately equated to something's wrong. Drugs, theft, fraud, or anything they could pin to justify the actions to come. The bitter truth was, they didn't need evidence, they didn't need a valid reason. They only needed their self-satisfaction in the belief that their uniforms and badges would shield any action they took. Danielle, in that moment, was fully aware of their gaze. She had seen it before, many times, in places she once thought she would be respected the most. Pentagon meeting rooms, congressional hearings, even on the battlefield, where her life had once been valued less because of her race and gender. She felt that energy in the air, that charged tension, full of implications, that those who've lived through discrimination can immediately identify. But she didn't change her stride. No rush, no turning back. She just walked forward with an incredible calm, like someone long accustomed to walking through thousands of scrutinizing gazes while maintaining her proud posture. Chad squinted, stepping forward, hand ready to fall on his gun belt. He didn't see a general. He didn't see someone who had once sworn to protect this nation with her life. He only saw an easy target, an opportunity to assert his small power by bringing someone he considered beneath him down. Peter Simmons followed closely behind, his eyes lighting up with the distinct eagerness Danielle recognized all too well. The dirty thrill of those who enjoy overpowering and humiliating others without facing consequences. Tonight, in the minds of the two officers, it would be just another quick action night. Stop the car, question, handcuff, assign a charge. Then, if there were any trouble, they could throw out some vague excuses about cooperation with investigation and reasonable suspicion. They didn't know that this time, the victim they had chosen carried not just the intellect, discipline, and strength of a warrior forged in real combat, but a network of power that stretched from the Pentagon to the highest echelons of the federal government. Danielle's steps paused as she reached the door of a small cafe. The weak neon light reflected off the smooth surface of her luxury car behind her, where the two officers were getting closer, their faces filled with the eager anticipation of predators about to pounce on what they thought was an easy, helpless target. A strange moment unfolded. In the span of a second, Danielle turned, her eyes locking directly with Chad Wilkinson's. No words, no threatening gesture. Just a steady, cold stare, thick with contempt, piercing as though she had seen right through the uniform, exposing all the cowardice hiding beneath. Chad hesitated for half a beat. He wasn't used to that look. He was used to fear, to submission, to eyes that avoided his or begged for mercy. Not indifference, coldness, and an almost ruthless demeanor that sent a chill crawling up his spine. Peter nudged him from behind, silently reminding him with his eyes. "Hurry up. Get it over with." Chad nodded, reassuring himself with the cheap arrogance still lingering. He stepped forward, hand on his belt, his voice louder than necessary to draw the attention of a few pedestrians passing by. "Please stop for a documents check." A crude demand, no reason given, no proof needed. A declaration of war, and the first shot in a battle they were about to lose miserably. Danielle exhaled gently, her shoulders not even quivering. She was prepared for battles far harder than this, and this time she wouldn't back down. The command came out of Sergeant Chad Wilkinson's mouth, sharp and accusatory, without any evidence. "I demand that you provide your driver's license and vehicle registration immediately." Danielle Brooks stood tall, her arms relaxed at her sides, her gaze as calm as a still lake on a windless night. She didn't take a step back, didn't lower her voice, and showed no sign of submission. Instead, her voice rang out, clear and slow, each word etched in the air. "Please provide the legal reason for the stop. Without a clear basis, I have the right to refuse to cooperate." In that moment, a tense silence enveloped the sidewalk where the three of them stood. A few passers-by who had already started to notice now stopped, pulling out their phones. There was something in the way Danielle spoke, no bravado, no fear, that made them realize this was not just a routine traffic stop. Chad Wilkinson paused for a moment, then furrowed his brow. That reaction was not part of the script he was used to. Most people he threatened would immediately fumble for their IDs, apologizing even when they didn't know what they were apologizing for. But the black woman standing before him was not flustered. She didn't lower her head. She didn't quiet her voice, and, most remarkably, she had the audacity to ask him to follow the law. To someone like Chad, that was an insult. Peter Simmons moved closer, positioning himself slightly behind Danielle, as if to block off any possible escape, even though there was no reason she should need to run. In Peter's eyes, there was no longer just contempt. There was anger. The frustration was evident in the clenched jaw and the premature motion of his hand reaching for his cuffs. "You're obstructing a law enforcement officer," Peter growled, while Chad moved to the left, trying to get into a more controlling position. "You fit the description of a wanted suspect. Now, show us your papers, or we'll act according to the law." Danielle gave a slight, dangerous smile, thin and sharp, like a steel blade sliding from its sheath. "What law? What statute? Who is this suspect? How tall are they? What color hair do they have? What color shirt are they wearing? You have no description, no evidence, no legitimate reason. All you have is prejudice." Chad couldn't take it anymore. His anger flared, not because Danielle had broken the law, but because she dared to challenge him in front of a crowd, dared to expose the cowardice behind the false power he always wore. Without saying another word, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a forceful, violent grip, spinning her toward the cruiser. "Fine, you want to talk about the law?" Chad gritted his teeth. "Resisting arrest, that's enough grounds for an arrest." Peter immediately cooperated, pulling the cuffs from his belt, clicking the metal clasp hurriedly and eagerly. They acted as if they had been waiting for this moment all night. Danielle didn't resist. She didn't need to. She knew she had been cast into the role they always wanted, the loud, defiant, black woman. Her arm was wrenched behind her, her back still straight, not a single groan. She didn't scream, didn't struggle. She just turned her head, her cold, sharp eyes locking with Chad's. "You're fabricating evidence, and everything you're doing right now is being recorded." It was at that moment that Chad realized. Around them, without him noticing, at least 6 phones were now trained on them. Passers-by had gathered more closely. Some were recording, others were quietly live-streaming. The false masks he had used to hide his actions began to crack, with each click of the camera sounding like nails being driven into the coffin of his career. Peter hesitated briefly, but Chad was too far gone to back off. He pressed Danielle's head against the hood of the car, an unnecessary action meant to assert cheap dominance, a final attempt to regain some sense of control. "Who do you think you are?" Chad spat. "Just because you have some education doesn't mean no one can touch you." Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her breath was even, her shoulders still, her gaze downward at the hood reflected an arrogance that made even him uneasy. A voice from the crowd spoke up. "She hasn't done anything wrong. I've seen it all. You have no right to treat her like this." Another voice chimed in. "I'm live streaming. People are watching. Hundreds of them." Peter began to feel nervous. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cold weather. His hand still gripped the cuffs, but his eyes flickered between Danielle, Chad, and the crowd. This was no longer a quick stop like they had thought. The situation was spiraling out of control. As for Chad, he clung to his illusion of power, trying to keep his voice steady. "Take her to the station, check her ID. If there's nothing, then we'll let her go." The last words came out like a weak confession, but he had no idea that in just a few minutes the name Danielle Brooks would become more than just a name. It would be the earthquake that shook the already decaying foundation of his career. And all the evidence of his abuse of power tonight would be handled by a general in a way he could never have imagined. The cold metal cuffs snapped tightly around Danielle Brooks' wrists, pulling them behind her, as cold as the January midnight air. Her wrists were pulled close together, aching, but she didn't flinch. Not a single groan escaped her lips. It was as if her body had grown accustomed to the bindings, yet her mind had never been subdued. She stood tall, head held high, shoulders straight, and her eyes, still as sharp as two cold blades, pierced into the one trying to corner her into the darkness. Sergeant Chad Wilkinson, with all the self-satisfaction that the silver badge on his chest brought, stepped forward, looking at her as if he had just caught an arrogant person who needed to be taught a lesson in order and submission. The familiar sneer returned to his lips, the kind that only appeared when he felt he had absolute control. "Now, who are you going to call, sister?" He snorted, gritting his teeth, his voice dripping with mockery. He expected her to be confused. He expected the cuffs to make her tremble. He expected the insults, the contempt, and the looming presence of Peter standing behind her to crush her confidence, just like it had with dozens, hundreds of others whom he had subdued with the same tactics. But he had underestimated the woman standing before him. Danielle didn't say anything for a few seconds. She simply exhaled deeply, as though counting down in her mind. Her anger was no longer there. The initial rage, if it had existed, was buried deep inside, replaced by a sharp calmness forged during years of commanding on the battlefield. She knew that impulsive emotions were a luxury, and that intelligent responses were her weapon. She tilted her head, glancing toward a young man in the crowd holding his phone up to record. He looked like a college student, wearing a faded gray hoodie and worn-out Nike sneakers, his confused gaze glued to the scene, as if not believing what he was witnessing. She looked at him, not smiling, but her eyes softened just enough for him to feel that she wasn't afraid, nor did she need sympathy. Then, in an unusually calm voice, she spoke clearly, as though reciting a code. "Call this number for me, 703-571-XXXX. Read the following code exactly. Echo Bravo, 79 Charlie Lima, Foxtrot 1. Both Chad and Peter froze. They didn't understand what she was saying. They didn't know that she had just recited an internal emergency activation code for the Pentagon, a line reserved for extreme situations. Danielle didn't need to hold the phone. She had memorized all emergency protocols, because, as a real general, you could never leave anything to others, even calling for backup. Chad stared at the student. "Hey, what are you doing? Don't listen to her." But the student dialed the number. Despite his shaky hands, he followed the woman's words, trusting her more than any police badge in sight. Peter took a step toward the student, but Danielle spoke, her voice now no longer soft. "I advise you not to interfere with the Defense Department contact. Any actions from this point will be considered obstruction of federal authority." That warning made both officers stop in their tracks, though they still hadn't fully grasped what was happening. The phone rang twice, then a deep, authoritative male voice came through the speaker. "This is the Pentagon security line. Please confirm your identity and access code." Both Chad and Peter were frozen in place. Chad's face turned pale, his eyes wide, his back stiff. Danielle didn't miss a beat. Her voice rang out immediately. "This is Brigadier General Danielle Brooks. I have just been unlawfully detained by 2 police officers, badges 4872 and 5193. I request immediate verification of authority and intervention." Peter took a half step back. Chad, struck as if by lightning, turned toward the radio on his shoulder, waiting for some miracle to erase the stupidity of his actions. But the miracle didn't come. Just then, Peter's radio crackled to life with a panicked, urgent, and cold voice. "All units, emergency order! Emergency order! Halt all activities in the area. Stop now. Do not approach the subject. A high-ranking official is involved. Repeat. All units, stand down now." The crowd murmured. The person live streaming raised their phone higher. The initial skepticism in the crowd shifted to sheer horror, not because the woman was dangerous, but because she had enough power to send the entire system into chaos with just a single phone call recited from memory. Peter let go of his belt as if he had touched a high-voltage power line. Chad stood still, sweating, his vision blurring. In that moment, he realized that the cold cuffs he had used to subjugate so many had now become the chain that would drag him to the bottom. Danielle remained standing, unshaken. Her gaze was no longer cold. It was like a mirror reflecting the fear in the eyes of the two men before her. "You just targeted the wrong person, and you're about to find out what that means." Danielle Brooks' final warning echoed in the thick air, heavy with the metallic scent of fear that was beginning to take shape. Chad Wilkinson felt like every sound around him had been suffocated. All that remained was the pounding of his heartbeat in his ears, a chaotic rhythm he couldn't control. Peter Simmons wasn't any better. His entire body was stiff, his sweaty hand gripping his gun belt like a lifeline in the storm that was rapidly approaching. Danielle Brooks, despite her hand still bound behind her, held her posture with unyielding dignity, as if she were the one giving orders in this chaotic scene. No tremor in her voice, no frantic glance, just a chilling calm, a strength honed over years of commanding on the battlefield, where a single wrong decision could bury an entire regiment. She scanned the crowd, her gaze resting on a young boy holding a phone, his eyes wide with worry. He looked like a college student, thin, wearing a faded hoodie and worn-out Nike shoes. He seemed like just another accidental witness, but now, in his hands, he held a direct link to the entire system of power operating behind Danielle. With an oddly calm voice, she spoke. "Young man, please call this number for me, 703-571-XXXX. When connected, please read the following code exactly as I give it." No panic, no hesitation. As if she were coordinating a military operation, not standing on a street corner, handcuffed by two local officers and surrounded by a skeptical crowd. The street seemed to hold its breath. Only the sound of the wind and the quick breaths of those about to witness an earthquake remained. The boy nodded, his fingers trembling but still pressing the correct numbers. Danielle lifted her chin, her voice firm and clear as she recited the military code, Echo Bravo 79, Charlie Lima, Foxtrot 1. The code meant nothing to ordinary people, but to those who had sat in tactical command centers, those symbols were the keys to the gateway of supreme power, a priority line reserved for national security emergencies. The phone buzzed in the boy's hand, 2 short rings. Then a deep, authoritative male voice came through the speaker, causing not only the boy, but also those around him to stop breathing. "This is the Pentagon security line. Please confirm your identity and access code." Peter Simmons swallowed hard, his eyes widening to the point where the whites were stark under the broken yellow street lamp. Chad Wilkinson glanced quickly at him, his face pale as ash, his body frozen. In that moment, Chad knew. This had gone beyond any control he ever imagined. Danielle didn't hesitate. She spoke immediately, her voice resonant, full of authority and certainty. "This is Brigadier General Danielle Brooks, Military ID 4-5-2-7-1. I am being unlawfully detained by 2 local police officers, badges 4872 and 5193, at the corner of Monroe Street and 8th Avenue. I request immediate verification of authority and support." As soon as she finished speaking, An oppressive silence fell over the street. No one spoke. No one dared to move. On the phone, after a brief moment, short, but in Chad and Peter's eyes it felt like an eternity, another voice came through, now more urgent and grave. Identity of General Brooks confirmed. Emergency response units are en route. All local units are required to stand down immediately. Cease all contact with the subject. Repeat, stand down. Do not approach the subject. Chad's radio crackled to life with a series of chaotic orders. All units, stop immediately. That is a federal target. Stop now. Peter took a full step back, his face drained of all color. Chad stood there, his hand limp, the cuffs still dangling from Danielle's belt, a living testament to his ignorance and arrogance. The crowd began to murmur, phones not only recording the scene, but also live streaming it to social media, where thousands of eyes were beginning to focus on this seemingly small event. The moment when two police officers, fueled by prejudice and abuse of power, unknowingly buried their careers in front of the whole world. Danielle turned back, locking eyes with Chad. Her gaze was no longer just a warning, it was a verdict. You just triggered a national security incident. You will pay for this stupidity and arrogance with your futures. Chad opened his mouth, likely to offer a justification or perhaps a desperate apology, but the shrill sirens in the distance cut through all other sounds. A convoy of black SUVs, their windows tinted and without plates, sped toward them, red and white lights flashing, reflecting off the cobblestones. The game was over, and those who thought power resided in their uniforms would soon realize that some people, even in the simplest of civilian clothes, carry the power of an entire nation within them. The sirens of the black SUV convoy tore through the air, their flashing red and white lights sweeping the street like tidal waves, reflecting off the glass of the surrounding buildings, bathing the space in a blinding, threatening glow. But even as the impending chaos approached, Danielle Brooks remained unmoving, like an unshakable pillar in the midst of a raging current. The handcuffs were still tightly fastened behind her. But true power, the power built on intellect, courage, and integrity, had never been bound. The phone in the young boy's hand remained connected, the speaker carrying the sharp, authoritative sounds from the other end. And while every eye was on her, Danielle Brooks, calm, her voice steady and clear, spoke directly into the phone. I am Brigadier General Danielle Brooks. 2 officers with badge numbers 4872 and 5193 have unlawfully detained me. I request immediate verification of their authority. That introduction, brief and concise, was like a bomb detonating in the tense air. Danielle didn't need to justify herself. She didn't need to explain. Just stating her name and rank was enough to set the wheels of power in motion behind the scenes. The night wind from the Potomac River whipped against the faces of those standing around, carrying a bone-chilling cold. But the cold from nature itself couldn't compare to the cold creeping down the spines of Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons. Both men stood frozen, eyes wide, hands stiff, breath caught in their chests. Over Peter's radio, a voice suddenly shouted, shattering the silence of the night. All units, stand down! Stand down! Stand down! This is a federal emergency! The voice no longer held the usual bureaucratic calm. It was sharp, firm, weighted with real fear, the kind of fear that only emerges when those within the system realize they've just stepped onto a mine they can't escape. Peter Simmons stumbled back, almost tripping on the sidewalk. He stammered, raising both hands as if to prove his innocence, but had no explanation for his recent actions. His eyes darted around, searching for a place to hide, an excuse, or at least a way out of the nightmare that was unfolding. Chad Wilkinson, however, didn't step back. Not out of bravery, but because he was too shocked, too frozen by the harsh reality bearing down on him. His mouth opened, as if to say something, but his throat was dry, like a desert, and only incoherent murmurs escaped. In that moment, Chad understood that every layer he had built up, the cheap confidence, the hollow power from his uniform and badge, had been stripped away in one night. And there was no way to undo it. From afar, the black SUV screeched to a halt in the middle of the street. The doors flung open, and federal agents in black suits, black sunglasses, and earpieces immediately dispersed, forming a protective semicircle around Danielle Brooks. No one had to shout orders. No one had to command. Every movement was synchronized, as if they had rehearsed for this moment their entire lives. A tall, stern agent, as solid as granite, stepped forward, quickly flashing a bright yellow badge before Chad and Peter. "Agent Ethan Moore, Department of Defense Security. You have unlawfully detained a high-ranking officer of the U.S. Department of Defense. Surrender all weapons, badges, and communication devices immediately. You are suspended on site and awaiting federal investigation." Chad stood frozen, his face drained of all color. Peter swayed like a drunk, his face flushed red with shame and panic. No one gave them a chance to argue. No one cared to hear an excuse, because their crimes had been documented too clearly in the phones of dozens of witnesses, in the sound waves from the radio, and most importantly, in the direct transcript of Danielle's call to the Pentagon. Another agent stepped forward, gently and respectfully removing the handcuffs from Danielle's wrists. The metal cuffs fell to the ground with a dry clink, the final sound marking the end of two police officers who had just buried their careers. Danielle flexed her wrists, exhaling deeply. She didn't look at Chad or Peter. She didn't need to. Her presence, composed, proud, and powerful, spoke louder than any uniform ever could. At that moment, one of the bystanders who had been live-streaming the event, now turning the camera toward Chad and Peter, began to record their faces. Pale, their hands shaking as they were stripped of their badges and escorted to the side of the road like criminals, under the contemptuous gaze of the public. The whispers from the crowd began to grow louder. "That's a general. Did they really just handcuff a U.S. general? This is going to be all over the news." And it was. That moment, the moment two abusers of power were exposed to the world, the moment a lone black woman, unarmed, in civilian clothes, with only her memory and resolve, toppled an entire system of discrimination, would become a symbol of uncompromising justice. Danielle picked up the phone, dialing another number, another call, another order, but this time not to save herself, but to ensure that those who swore to protect justice, yet betrayed it, would never have the chance to hurt anyone again. Danielle Brooks decisively ended the call on the speakerphone, then lowered her hand, her gaze still calm, but with a simmering fire that burned away every distorted belief Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons had clung to. The air around them thickened, and the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Phones raised higher, cameras pointing straight at the two officers standing frozen like defeated soldiers on the battlefield. And then, just as the cold promise had echoed through the phone, 3 unmarked black SUVs screeched up, skimming across the asphalt before slamming to a halt at the scene. The sound of tires grinding against the road left dark black streaks like signs of an impending storm. The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously, with a synchrony that sent chills down the spine of anyone who witnessed it. From within the vehicles, a group of federal agents dressed in sleek black suits, dark sunglasses, and earpieces sprang out, moving with the speed and precision of a highly trained Special Forces team. Each of them exuded a cold, lethal presence, an authenticity that couldn't be faked. the kind only formed after years of serving in the highest national security units. In the blink of an eye, they split into formation. 2 officers blocked both ends of the street, 3 spread out to encircle the area, while the remaining 4 moved directly toward the spot where Danielle Brooks stood. Not a single one of them glanced at Chad Wilkinson or Peter Simmons. No sympathetic gaze, no gesture of support. Because at this moment, the 2 officers were no longer law enforcement in the eyes of the federal system. They were just 2 individuals who had touched a living symbol of America, and that, in any internal security protocol, was classified as the gravest offense. Peter Simmons, as if struck from behind, took 2 steps back. He had never seen a force move so fast, so smoothly, so coldly. Chad Wilkinson, meanwhile, could only clench his hands until his knuckles turned white, his back soaked in sweat, despite the cold wind blowing from the river. The team leader, a tall, graying man, his muscular frame concealed beneath his perfectly tailored black suit, stepped directly in front of Danielle. He nodded slightly, his voice steady, carrying the weight of true authority. "General Brooks, ma'am, we've arrived by direct order from the Secretary of Defense. We are taking full control of the scene. Permission to proceed with Level 1 security protocol." Danielle nodded in response, her eyes briefly flicking over to Chad and Peter, a glance that held no anger, no scorn, simply a sentence that needed no words. The team leader signaled, and immediately 2 other agents moved in, disarming them, removing their radios, stripping their badges off like peeling away the last layer of power they clung to. Every action was cold, efficient, no wasted words, no pitying glances. Peter Simmons tried to speak, to explain something. "We didn't know. We were just following procedure." But the agent standing before him didn't respond. He merely extended a thick white envelope, stamped with red. "Emergency suspension order." Peter hesitated, reaching out to take it, but his hands trembled so violently the envelope nearly slipped from his grasp. Chad Wilkinson was in worse shape. He stood motionless, his eyes glued to the ground, lips pressed tightly together in a faint, bloodless line. He knew that any words he spoke now would only make the situation more disastrous. And then, a scene that the crowd would never forget unfolded before their eyes. 2 police officers, once commanders of the neighborhood through power and fear, now escorted like criminals, no badges, no guns, no signs of authority left to command anyone. Danielle Brooks, in her simple civilian coat, standing still, and letting the entire justice system operate for her. Agent Ethan Moore turned, bowing his head respectfully to Danielle. "We've seized the weapons and badges of the 2 suspects. Federal charges will be filed tonight. Do you have any further requests before we leave the scene?" Danielle paused for a breath, then turned her face to the crowd, her voice ringing out, clear and unwavering but not shouting. "Anyone here who feels they've been discriminated against by the individuals who were arrested tonight, please file a formal complaint. Every case will be investigated thoroughly. Justice doesn't end with me. It starts with all of us." Scattered applause began, then grew louder, swelling like a tidal wave, sweeping away the heavy atmosphere that had hung over the scene. Phones continued to record. Eyes glinted with newfound hope. Chad and Peter were escorted to one of the black SUVs. No chains, no violence. But the shame and internal collapse they felt were 1,000 times more terrifying than any physical punishment. That night, the small street witnessed a valuable lesson. True power does not lie in badges or guns. It lies in dignity, in intellect, and in the resolve never to bow before injustice. The applause was still ringing out when the voice of Police Chief Raymond Morales, choked and faltering, suddenly crackled through the radio of one of the quick response officers, breaking the tense moment that had enveloped the scene. "You just handcuffed a senior officer from the Pentagon. God help you." There was no anger, no defense, only desperation. Like the brief sound of a horn at a funeral, one that Morales knew there was no way to stop. On the street, bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of federal vehicles, Chad Wilkinson heard his superior's voice booming through the radio, and he couldn't stop the shiver that spread through his body. He stammered, his stiff hands fumbling with the handcuff lock, trying to undo it quickly, as if the mechanical actions could erase everything that had happened. But the metal cuff mocked him. The lock stuck due to his frantic, panicked attempts, making him clumsily fumble and adding to the humiliation he was already feeling. Peter Simmons, who had always relied on Chad's decisiveness, now found himself clinging to no one. He trembled, his eyes darting toward the crowd, where dozens of phones were still recording every little movement. The panic pushed Peter into a half-conscious state, his feet moving back instinctively, wanting to disappear from the scene, but there was no place to hide. And then, amidst the growing murmurs and hundreds of scrutinizing eyes, when Chad finally managed to remove the cuff from Danielle Brooks' wrist, both officers stood frozen, like two statues of guilt, no life left in them. Danielle, her wrists now free, didn't rush to rub the pain away, nor did she show any expression other than cold silence. She simply turned to face Chad and Peter, her deep black eyes sweeping over them, a look that needed no words but carried the harshest sentence that any court could never convey with language. In that moment, Chad realized that every attempt to remove the cuffs, every excuse, every attempt to blame the circumstances or a misunderstanding had become meaningless. The evidence, the clear video footage, the testimonies of dozens of witnesses, and the direct call to the Pentagon had locked them into an invisible cuff far scarier than the steel one. A ding sounded from the phone of someone in the crowd. The news began to spread, quickly as a wildfire during the dry season. The first headline appeared on the screen. 2 police officers unlawfully detain female general. Pentagon intervenes. Each press of the share button, each enraged comment followed by thousands, tens of thousands of views within minutes. Police Chief Raymond Morales, sitting in his office just a few blocks away from the scene, hung his head on his desk. He knew he had lost. Not in a lawsuit, not before a jury, but in a battle for reputation, a battle where even the smallest misstep leads to irreparable consequences. Morales picked up the radio again, this time his voice no longer holding any pretense of dignity. "Direct all units, halt all operations at the scene, cooperate fully with federal forces. The case will be handed over immediately. All related reports must be sent directly to the Department of Justice." No one in the patrol unit dared to argue. Under different circumstances, the chief's orders might have been questioned, but now they weren't orders. They were the last will of a system about to collapse. And amidst the crackling radio static, flashing lights, and the continuous click of cameras, Danielle Brooks slowly walked toward the federal SUV. Each of her steps echoed firmly on the pavement, like the beat of a drum marking the funeral procession for the careers of those who thought they could insult the dignity of others without consequence. Peter tried to lunge forward, his voice a desperate whisper. We didn't know who you were." The words, fragile, torn like a rag in the wind. Danielle paused, just for a brief moment. Without turning back, she spoke. "Not knowing who I am is not an excuse for your abuse of power. No one needs to be famous to be respected as a human being. And now, you'll learn that lesson in the most bitter way." The crowd erupted in gasps of astonishment and rounds of applause. But for Chad and Peter, those sounds rang like the hammering of nails into a coffin. Danielle Brooks' final words echoed into the night like an unassailable and cold indictment, leaving Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons standing frozen amidst the flashing lights from dozens of phones recording every moment. Without so much as a glance back, Danielle turned and walked directly toward the open black SUV, where a federal agent in dark sunglasses, hand to his earpiece, nodded respectfully in anticipation. In her hand, she held the phone that had been returned to her, the screen still lit, as if inviting the next move she had long since planned in her mind. Danielle raised her head, scanning the thick, oppressive atmosphere around her, and with a decisive motion she dialed a pre-programmed number. The phone rang only once before the connection was made. On the other end, a deep, authoritative voice instantly responded, "Deputy Secretary McAllister speaking." "What's the situation, General Brooks?" Danielle didn't need to beat around the bush or fill the air with pleasantries. Her voice, though low, was sharp as a blade freshly honed. "I'm requesting an immediate internal investigation order. Target, Sergeant Chad Wilkinson and Officer Peter Simmons, Monroe District Police Department. I demand a full review of their stop and search history, arrests, and any related civil complaints from the past 3 years. I want a preliminary report on my desk before dawn." On the other end, there was a brief moment of silence, not from hesitation but from astonishment at the speed and decisiveness of the general. Then, with astonishing quickness, McAllister's voice dropped, firm and assured. "Understood. I will personally direct the Military Inspector General and the Department of Justice to coordinate. A red-level priority order will be issued within 5 minutes. Do you require anything else?" Danielle glanced briefly at Chad and Peter, who were still standing motionless like 2 soulless statues amidst the occupied scene. "I need all documents related to these 2 officers to remain classified until the investigation is complete. Any destruction, alteration, or delay from within will be prosecuted criminally. I want this incident to set a precedent, a lesson, a milestone." McAllister's voice, on the other end, conveyed a respect that couldn't be hidden. "Understood, General. The order is now in effect. We will ensure no one escapes responsibility." Danielle hung up, slipped the phone back into her coat pocket, and slowly walked back to the center of the scene. Now nearly silent, with only the sound of the wind and frozen gazes remaining. She stopped right in front of Chad and Peter, just a few steps away. No federal agents intervened. No one shielded them. Because they understood that this was her moment. A moment for her to deliver judgment. Not through a courtroom, not through a jury, but through her very presence, through the weight of the truth and justice she represented. Danielle crossed her arms in front of her chest, her cold gaze piercing through the last remnants of defense that Chad and Peter still clung to. "You think you're strong because you have the power to arrest, because you wear badges, because you have a gun at your hip," she began, her voice not loud, but resonating through the night like the toll of a bell. "But true power is not in those things. It's in using that authority to protect, not to oppress. To ensure justice, not to feed a diseased ego. You forgot that. And now, the very system you once exploited will come back and swallow you whole." Peter trembled like a branch in the wind. Chad, despite trying to maintain a stoic expression, couldn't hide the cold sweat trickling down his forehead. "You didn't just offend me today. You offended the very principles this country was built on, that every citizen, regardless of race or status, deserves to be treated with dignity. And I, with all my authority and honor, will make sure you pay for every action you've taken." No applause was needed, no cheers, only silence, a silence heavier than any boos, descended upon Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons, crushing them in a flood of guilt and collapse they couldn't escape. Danielle turned and strode back toward the black SUV. One of the agents immediately opened the door for her, a gesture as flawless as if welcoming a head of state. As Danielle stepped into the vehicle, a strong gust of wind swept through the street, carrying away the ashes of the power illusions Chad and Peter had once harbored. It was like a cleansing, a cruel reminder that in this country, justice, though delayed, would never be lost. The door of the SUV shut, concealing Danielle's figure. The convoy of SUVs began to roll away slowly from the scene, leaving behind the two men who had just been judged, and a community that had been restored with faith in justice. That night, Monroe District would never be the same, and the names Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons would forever be tied to an indelible disgrace. As the SUV door slammed shut, the engine hummed softly beneath its armored steel frame, but outside, the atmosphere remained frozen, encapsulating Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons in the inescapable humiliation of their power stripped bare. Even as the federal vehicle began to roll away, Danielle Brooks kept her gaze fixed through the window, as if an invisible spear was piercing straight through the twisted consciences of the two men who had once believed that a uniform could shield them from their wrongdoings. She didn't need to roll down the window. She didn't need to shout. Just one look. A look that contained an entire world of cold disdain and an unshakable affirmation. And then, as if the cold wind that swept through Monroe District carried her final message, Danielle Brooks turned her head, her eyes still fixed on the two men drowning in their shame, and spoke, not loud, not hurried, but cold as a blade striking stone. Today, you chose the wrong target, but rest assured, I will ensure you never have the chance to choose wrongly again. Each word she spoke, every sentence, felt like a sharp dagger cutting through the layers of illusion that Chad and Peter had wrapped around themselves throughout the years of abusing their power. No more shiny badges to mask the rotting inside. No more reluctant respect from a community oppressed under their guns. Only two small men, trembling, lost amidst a sea of onlookers witnessing their irreversible downfall. Chad Wilkinson clenched his fists, not to resist, but to stop his hands from trembling too visibly. He felt the blood rush to his face, but this time, it wasn't confidence. It was the fever of humiliation and fear. He had once thought himself invincible, that no matter how wrong his actions were, they could always be shielded by the system. He was wrong. Peter Simmons, beside him, fared no better. His body shook like a leaf in the wind. All the tricks, all the justifications he had stealthily learned over the years now seemed utterly useless. Because this time, he wasn't facing an ordinary citizen, one who could be intimidated by the usual obstruction of justice threat. He had chosen wrong. A warrior, a symbol, a woman even the U.S. government had to respect. The sound of the SUV's tires rolling on the pavement grew faint, leaving Chad and Peter standing there, no one touching them, but no one approaching either. The crowd parted around them, eyes filled with contempt, as if fearing that even a brush against them would taint them with the spreading shame. The phones kept recording. The murmurs grew louder. That's a general. How stupid are these cops? All their careers ruined because of racism. Truly disgraceful. No one needed to shout. No one needed signs or protests. The shame was silently transmitted but deeply, like a verdict that needed no court, no judge. And then, like the final blow to their already rotting honor, a local reporter, microphone branded with a famous news channel logo, pushed through the crowd, pointing the camera directly at Chad and asking with a cold tone, "Anything to say to the public, Sergeant Wilkinson, after everything that's happened tonight?" Chad stood there, mouth agape, unable to utter a word. Peter lowered his head, hoping that if he bent low enough he might disappear from the shame that surrounded him. No apologies, no justifications, nothing left to salvage. Across the street, Police Chief Raymond Morales sat in his command SUV, watching everything unfold from a distance. His face, under the dim glow of streetlights, was as gray as ashes. He didn't give the order to intervene. He couldn't. There was no way to protect the subordinates who had betrayed the very spirit the uniform was supposed to uphold. Morales sighed, a deep, painful sigh, then turned his back, signaling the driver to leave. He knew. After tonight, everything would be forever changed. And at the end of the street, under the flashing lights of traffic signals, Danielle Brooks's SUV disappeared into the night, leaving behind a powerful and unshakable message. Justice doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes justice only needs to stand firm, calm, and let the wrongdoers destroy themselves. As the black SUV carrying Danielle Brooks disappeared into the night, the city's flashing lights fading in the distance, what was left behind was not just two defeated men standing frozen on the sidewalk, but the seeds of a storm silently forming. A storm that Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons, with their blind arrogance, had sown themselves. And just as an inevitable consequence, the next morning, as Monroe City shook off the night's grip, with the first weak rays of sunlight yet to dry the rainwater from the night before, every major news outlet, from CNN, MSNBC to Fox News, broadcast the breaking news. 2 officers arrested for illegally handcuffing U.S. general. It wasn't just a sensational headline. It wasn't just a 30-second news clip amidst the usual daily events. It was an earthquake, a direct blow to the already fragile public trust in law enforcement. From the large screens at airports, hospital waiting rooms, to every smartphone in the hands of the citizens, the clip of the officers being escorted, hands shackled, heads lowered, was played and replayed, serving as a vivid testament to the complete collapse of the power once protected by uniforms and badges. The news reports spared no words in their descriptions. Careless behavior, clear lack of authority, and blatant racial discrimination. The worst abuse of power caught on tape this year. A painful slap in the face of the local police force. On morning talk shows, legal experts, former government officials, and social activists appeared one by one, analyzing every frame, every minute detail of the incident. The faces of Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons were magnified on the large screens, accompanied by captions that could not be more brutal. Emergency suspension, facing charges of abuse of power, illegal detention, and violation of civil rights. Meanwhile, in a corner of the city, Chad Wilkinson sat curled up in his cramped apartment, curtains drawn, the cold blue light from the TV screen casting a pallid hue across his pale face. Each time the commentator's voice sounded, each time the clip of him being handcuffed played again, he clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, but could do nothing but growl in silence. He tried to turn off the TV, tried to turn off his phone, tried to avoid social media. But how could he escape? His name, his image, his story had been pushed to the forefront of every major news platform. He was no different from a criminal nailed to a cross. Every click, every share, every furious comment striking directly at his decaying self-esteem. Peter Simmons fared no better. His family cut ties with him, his friends turned their backs, his superiors refused to answer his calls. His longtime girlfriend sent a single, cold message before blocking him. "I can't believe I ever loved a racist. Handle your own consequences." Peter threw his phone at the wall, feeling as if the world was collapsing in chunks beneath him. But he knew it wasn't the world that had betrayed him. He had betrayed the world, betrayed the oath to protect justice, betrayed the trust of those who had believed in the uniform he wore. On the other side of the city, in a small meeting room at the Pentagon, Danielle Brooks sat silently before a large screen showing the live broadcast. She didn't smile. She wasn't pleased. Only a profound silence remained, the silence of someone who had fought too long, witnessed too many collapses, and understood that every victory, no matter how deserved, always came with a steep price. A young assistant entered, placing a thick file on the table. Preliminary report on the activities of Wilkinson and Simmons, General. Numerous violations found, complaints hidden, and even accusations swept under the rug. Danielle wasn't surprised. She nodded slightly, flipping through a few pages, each line confirming something she already knew. Arrogance born from unchecked privilege will always lead to disaster. And it was the job of people like her, those who never sit idle in the face of injustice, to make sure that every disaster was exposed to the light. In the city's government offices, emergency meetings were called one after another. Politicians awkwardly scrambled to salvage their image. Lawyers debated the legal damages. Senior officers bowed their heads before cameras, reading prepared apologies that everyone knew were hollow. But all those efforts seemed small, ridiculous, in the face of the rising storm of public outrage. On social media, one hashtag was leading the national trend. Justice for Danielle Brooks, millions shared. Hundreds of thousands called for police reform, and thousands of photos of Danielle Brooks in civilian clothes, head held high, eyes full of determination, spread like wildfire, becoming a new symbol of courage and justice. For Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons, this wasn't just a temporary humiliation. It was a permanent sentence engraved on their lives. No matter where they lived, no matter how many times they changed their names or tried to hide their past, they would forever be remembered by all of America as a lesson that could never be forgotten. The heat from the media storm had barely begun to subside when, that very night, as the lights of Monroe City still shimmered on the wet streets, Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons were immediately suspended under an urgent order from the highest command, an order issued without any explanations or excuses. There were no formalities, no disciplinary meetings to explain their actions. Only cold suspension papers, black ink on white paper, placed before them like indictments that needed no trial. Forced to surrender their guns, badges, and IDs that very night, both men left the police station like strangers, the eyes of their former colleagues watching them with a mix of shock and fearful disgust, as if afraid that they, too, might one day become the next sacrificial victims in the rising storm of justice. The following morning, the internal investigation, directly led by the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice, began with unprecedented speed. Gone was the usual bureaucratic delay. No more reconsiderations or further studies. Every record related to Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons was meticulously reviewed, every line, every comma, every old audio recording. And what they uncovered was even worse than the public had imagined. For Chad Wilkinson, the list of violations stretched out like a map of degradation, repeatedly pulling over drivers without cause, targeting black drivers under the guise of routine checks. A series of internal reports from colleagues accusing him of aggressive, rude behavior and clear discriminatory conduct toward Black and Latino citizens. 2 civil lawsuits had been filed, but were quietly dismissed through out-of-court settlements, with the compensation drawn from the city's insurance fund, and no one held personally accountable. Furthermore, in the internal radio recordings stored, Chad was repeatedly caught making racist comments, twisted jokes about the skin color and origins of those he had sworn to protect. Peter Simmons fared no better. Though he often played the role of the silent accomplice, his complicity was evident in every report. An accomplice in at least 8 unlawful stops, all involving Black or Latino victims. Altered records after incidents to cover up evidence of abuse. Once caught trying to convince a victim not to file a complaint, promising a reduced sentence if they remained silent. Every action, every small decision, which they had thought would forever remain beyond the reach of the law, was now laid bare under the brilliant light of truth. There was no way to salvage it, no one to defend them, and no one willing to burn themselves to protect 2 men who had become symbols of disgrace. The Internal Disciplinary Board, in less than 48 hours after the incident broke, convened and unanimously voted with absolute certainty. Permanent expulsion of Sergeant Chad Wilkinson and Officer Peter Simmons from law enforcement, with a recommendation to place them on the federal blacklist, barring them from rejoining any security or law enforcement agency nationwide. A press release was sent out later that afternoon. The voice of the city spokesperson, while trying to maintain professionalism, could not hide the bitterness as they announced the decision. We acknowledge the failings in our management. We apologize to the community for allowing this incident to occur, and we commit to not tolerating any actions that violate the dignity and rights of our citizens. When Chad Wilkinson received the official notice, he could only slump into the old chair in his cheap rented apartment, his empty eyes staring blankly at the thin piece of paper that felt heavier than 1,000 pounds. Everything he had once taken pride in, the badge, the gun, the uniform, the small but deadly power, had now vanished like bubbles under the scorching sun of justice. Peter Simmons fared even worse. He received a subpoena from the Department of Justice. Not only was he fired, but he could also face criminal charges for violating federal civil rights. His day in court would come soon, and this time, no uniform, no badge, no superior could save him. On social media, as Chad and Peter sank deeper into society's oblivion, the image of Danielle Brooks continued to spread. A simple woman, in civilian clothes, her head held high, her gaze resolute, a symbol of courage and justice regained through intellect, bravery, and an unwavering belief in the rule of law. In hundreds of articles, thousands of comments, one line from her was repeated most often: "You chose the wrong target, and I will make sure you never have the chance to choose wrongly again." That warning had now become an irreversible reality. The careers of Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons, along with everything they once held dear, had come to a permanent end. The career of Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons crumbled like a tower built on sand, leaving behind only the shattered remnants of their brazen arrogance and the constant curses of the public. But while the city of Monroe simmered with tense discussions about police reform, while the media relentlessly published analyses, condemnations, and expert interviews, the person at the center of the storm, General Danielle Brooks, remained completely silent. Danielle did not file lawsuits. She did not hold press conferences. She did not seek compensation. She did not demand public apologies. She simply let her actions in the justice system of the United States speak for her, and paradoxically, that silence resounded louder than any defense or grand statement could. The story of that fateful night quickly spread across every social media platform, like an unstoppable wave, like a cold slap to the face of those who still clung to prejudice and racial discrimination under the guise of procedures and protocol. On Twitter, millions of shares appeared within 24 hours, accompanied by short but powerful statements. Justice wears the color of courage. Justice has the gaze that does not bow. Instagram flooded with photos of Danielle Brooks standing tall in the streets of Monroe, handcuffed, but her eyes still blazing with unshakable pride, like a living statue of human dignity in an era where it had been trampled. On TikTok, short clips from the live stream of that night went viral, paired with powerful background music and poignant quotes, stirring in the hearts of millions the belief that, even though injustice exists, there will always be souls strong enough to stand up and challenge it. But Danielle did not partake in those noisy celebrations. She didn't post thank yous, didn't appear on talk shows, didn't lay down demands to the city of Monroe or the police department. Instead, she spent the following days doing one thing: quietly healing the wounds that the incident had left behind. She held private meetings with community leaders, police reform advocates, and human rights organizations. No media, no cameras, only honest, raw, painful dialogues about the realities of discrimination, about the fear that people of color still face daily in their own country. Danielle understood better than anyone that a victory in the media wasn't enough to change a system. For true change to happen, one had to dig deep, tear down, and rebuild, brick by brick, habit by habit, thought by thought. In a closed meeting with representatives from the Department of Justice and the governor's office, Danielle spoke, not with eloquent words, but with an irrefutable logic, forged from experience and integrity. If a system allows people like Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons to exist and thrive, the fault does not lie with them alone. The fault lies in every crack, every loophole of that system. If you want to protect the honor of the police force, first, you must have the courage to eliminate what is tarnishing it. The room went completely silent. No one dared interrupt, because in her voice there was not just condemnation. There was a call for the good-hearted to stand with justice before it's too late. And Danielle's quiet efforts began to yield the first results. An independent investigation committee was established to review all activities of the Monroe Police Department from the last 5 years. Regulations on vehicle stops and administrative checks were tightened with more transparent criteria, mandating recording and detailed reporting. Mandatory training on anti-racism and social justice was implemented down to the patrol level. Most importantly, a new law, titled Danielle's Law, was introduced, requiring mandatory response procedures for any citizen stopped or checked, with immediate access to legal counsel if they feel they've been treated unfairly. And the law was being discussed in the state legislature with strong support from both parties. Meanwhile, in neighborhoods once victimized by discrimination, a quiet but noticeable change was spreading. The residents began to believe that their voices mattered, that a head held high, a straightforward demand for fairness could and would make a difference. Danielle Brooks, the woman who chose silence as her action over flowery words, never claimed to be a hero. She quietly did what any soldier would understand, that victory does not lie in defeating an opponent, but in rebuilding what is right from the ruins. And with each quiet but steady step, she etched another lesson into the history of the United States. True justice does not need to shout to exist. It needs the courage to stand tall, and it needs souls who will never accept kneeling before injustice. The quiet yet powerful changes spreading from the Monroe District incident seemed to plant new seeds of hope within the community. But deep in the hearts of all who witnessed it, from ordinary citizens to national leaders, the most enduring image remained that of the woman in the simple civilian attire, standing tall, her gaze steadfast, and a strength radiating without the need for any rank or slogan. Though she wore nothing more than a simple gray coat, worn leather boots, and a modest backpack, Danielle Brooks carried herself with the spirit of a general, a spirit that required no declarations, no badges, and whose mere silent presence was enough to make the whole world pay attention. And when reporters finally got the chance to approach Danielle, at a closed conference on security reform held in a small community center on the outskirts, she only paused in front of the camera for a brief moment. The flashlights went off repeatedly. Loud questions surrounded her, but Danielle Brooks did not rush to respond. She stood still, waiting for the noise to subside, and then spoke, her voice low yet resonating, like an undeniable declaration. Rank is not in the uniform. Rank is in the demeanor, and those who discriminate, no matter what clothes they wear, will always be judged by justice. Not by guns, but by the truth. Not by oppressive authority, but by the strength to never bow down. No long speeches were needed, no hero image was painted. With just those words, Danielle Brooks cemented a truth. True rank is not bestowed by skin color, gender, or social status. True rank is defined by how one faces adversity and stands firm to protect their dignity. After that conference, Danielle quietly left, refusing all interview invitations, turning down offers to appear on famous talk shows. She returned to her daily work at the Department of Defense, continuing to attend security meetings and strategic campaigns upon which the nation's very existence depended, with decisions made quietly in the background. For Danielle, true victory did not lie in the spotlight, but in continuing to do what was right, even when no one was watching. Meanwhile, the story of the Monroe night lived on in the minds of the public as a powerful reminder. That real power does not lie in weapons or badges, but in the ability to stand tall in the face of injustice. Hundreds of schools across the United States incorporated the story of Danielle Brooks into their civics curriculum. Law professors used the case as a prime example in lessons on civil rights and the moral responsibility of law enforcement. On countless forums, the phrase "Danielle's demeanor" became a symbol of courage and unwavering determination. As for Chad Wilkinson and Peter Simmons, the two names once associated with arrogance and discrimination, they had vanished from the limelight, fleeing from a society that no longer tolerated those who abused their power. But the lesson they left behind remained, like a scar, an immortal warning. Not to curse them, but to remind anyone, no matter where they are, no matter their skin color, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And those who forget that will sooner or later face the judgment of justice, in one way or another. In an internal letter sent to the young officers at the Department of Defense, Danielle Brooks wrote, in simple yet profoundly humane words, "You may be given weapons, you may wear a badge, you may hold a rank, wear shining insignia. But remember, your true value is not in the outward things. It's in how you use your authority to uplift, not suppress others. A country is truly strong when every soldier, every officer, every public servant understands that they are not just keepers of the law, but protectors of the dignity of every citizen. Never forget that. For when justice comes, it will not ask for anyone's skin color, but will look straight into the hearts of every person." The story of Danielle Brooks ended, not with a grand sentence or a celebratory parade, but with the quiet yet resolute presence of justice being restored. A lesson engraved deep into the fabric of society. A reminder not only for those who'd gone astray, but for an entire new generation. Rank is not in skin color. It is not in the uniform. It is not in the badge. Rank is in how you treat the vulnerable when you hold power in your hands. And history will remember not those who were arrogant in the dark, but those who bravely lit the flame of justice with their unbroken hearts. If it were you, how would you respond when faced with injustice like General Danielle Brooks? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories and reflections. Don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. Thank you for staying with me until the end of today's story.